Hello, everyone. We're going to let everyone come on in. Wow, you're all coming in fast.
Woo. Look at this.
I like this. Welcome back. We're putting the band back together here.
All right.
My Blues Brothers.
All right.
Fine.
Wow, we're on two screens in the course of 30 seconds here. Len, what did you do? What did you promise them?
Well,
No.
it was simple. I promised them you.
Where do you see Len Cooper? It's
Larry Abel.
it's a lawyer thing. So this is Len Cooper's wife, Wendy.
Hello, everyone. We're still forming. So I'm Len Bernstein. Welcome to year 21 of Lunch and Learn. And let's just wait another minute. If you could all put your phones or computers on mute, that will improve the sound. That's great. Waiting to see if Tom Byron is on because he had an announcement, but Eric, I don't see him. Do you?
You all keep moving around as new people come in, so I'm like getting
We'll come back to him.
give me a second here. I don't see him.
Okay.
I don't see him right now.
All right.
Let's give it
We have some announcements first, so we'll see if he joins. Well, it's about 12:32. Let me welcome everyone to year 21 of Adath Israel's Lunch and Learn.
Len, you're muted.
Okay.
There we go.
Sorry
Okay.
about that.
Welcome everyone to year 21 of our Adath Israel Lunch and Learn. If everybody could mute their screens, sound will be improved. It is so rewarding to see everyone together again. We're going to plan another year for now of virtual Lunch and Learns, although we could change that down the road. We're also going to have Rabbi Eric with us for the first part of our season. We'll certainly have Rabbi Andy. We'll hopefully have another session with Kenar Shamash. That was an incredible session that she provided. And we'll have other surprises as current events determine. We're making another attempt to get CLE. Although I'm not optimistic, but for the lawyers on the line, we'll let you know. We put the inquiry into PBI. And I wanted to lastly ask you to send me names of folks that should be on the list or that should be removed from the list. Rabbi Eric, you have a lot on your plate, and we appreciate the time you make for us. And for me, the incredible collaboration of coming up with topics that are so relevant. And today is no exception. A very interesting topic, relevant to current events, relevant to the high holidays. And let's get started. So Rabbi, you have the floor. And if Tom joins us, maybe towards the end, we'll ask him to make his announcement. But go ahead.
Sounds good. And if not, Len, just if you don't mind, because often I'll forget as we are culminating, just we won't do the Tom's announcement justice, but we'll do the best we can between the two of us. So if you can pull up that information too. So welcome and welcome back, everyone. I apologize if you hear shrieks in the background. We are broadcasting straight at you from my house where I have two kids home, thanks to COVID protocols. So we are, you may see some faces. You may see some extra faces on my screen. You know, and if you only get that lucky. But there is Paw Patrol blasting in the background, and I'm hoping that that will be enough of a well, digital sedative to get us through this. What can I say? Oh, more people coming in. Hold on for 1 second. It is good to see you. It is good to be together. And when Len and I started talking about things, you know, we always want to be where people's heads are and try to give a Jewish lens. And this, at least as long as I've been here for this, which is a dozen of the 21 years, we always want to try to give a Jewish lens to something that might be in the public conversation in terms of current events. The challenge for that in today's fraught and politicized and polarized world is that the challenge and the benefit is that people are inevitably going to come in with certain preconceived notions and disagreements. And my approach to that, so you know, is a couple of things. And I apologize for those of you who already know this about me, but you'll hear it again because you know, doesn't hurt to have a refresher. And that is that when we approach these topics, we try to do it sort of from the you know, 10,000 foot level and say, what are the meta issues that are going on here that are trying to drive this in terms of Jewish values? What are the Jewish values that are driving this? We don't talk about parties, political parties. We don't talk about candidates or people. We talk about ideas. It is true that some of those ideas are, especially in today's world, aligned with the certain parties, and others are aligned with other parties. We'll leave it at that. And that may rile you, or it may validate you, but I would hope that it actually does neither. And the reason I think I don't want it to just validate you is because that's not good learning. You don't need someone to tell you what you already think you know. And it is also not good learning if you get so upset about it that you can't hear the nuance and the text and the wisdom that comes to inform these issues. The other thing that is, I can't say always, but almost always true when we look at these things through a Jewish lens is that they are complicated. And the challenge that I have week in, week out, talking about issues of relevance and importance to people, is that our society tends, through sound bites and social media and media clickbait, to oversimplify things so that the things that are complicated, that have genuine nuance to them and ramifications one way or the other, are minimized, such that if anyone says anything to sort of countervail that, that person is immediately put in the not incorrect camp, but evil camp. And that is just the way our minds have been trained to work in today's world. And I mourn that. You have all heard me say that at some point in time. If you've ever been on one of these, if you haven't been on one of these, or in shul, on Shabbat, on the holidays, in a class that I've taught, if you haven't heard me say that, the only thing I can say to you at this point in time is, welcome. I've never met you before. And so welcome to this wonderful gathering, because everyone who has heard me teach on any topic of current relevance has heard me give that disclaimer. And so the challenge that I would hope, oh, someone is trying to come in, but it's not someone with a name. And so I want to message that person. I'm going to message that person so that we can ask them to identify themselves for security. Give me 1 second, I apologize. Okay. The challenge that I would ask of you at this time going in is that you feel challenged. You open yourself to feeling challenged. Because if you walk away from this saying any of the following things, we will have done our job. One is, I hadn't thought about the two sides of this complicated issue. That would be a great result. Another thing would be, wow, what I thought was obvious may not be obvious. And the other thing that would be great is, wow, this thing that I thought was completely anathema and a horrible political stance on things may, in certain cases, have merit that causes me to see people who disagree with me not as wrong, not as evil, but as human, and with disagreement, what we call in Hebrew a machloket l'shem shamayim, a worthy debate. So that's the and all of that is hard because every way that you have taken in news for the past, I'm going to say decade, pushes against what I just asked you to do. And this is not even necessarily one of the hottest button issues that we might have done this on when we get to loan forgiveness. But I'm asking you to think in a way that, sadly, I think to our detriment as a society, I think we have been deconditioned from. So that is very often what we do. I hope that is a good mental exercise from you. And I hope that you disagree with me, or that you have questions, or that you recognize how complicated this is. That's what I have to say. Whoever is iPad 7 is clearly having trouble. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to let this person in. If this happens to be a Zoom bombing situation, I doubt that it is. What I will ask is that I will turn off the Zoom and then everyone will hop back on again if we start to get an issue. Just hop right back on, click right back on the link, and I will deal with it. But I don't want to shut someone out who's having technical difficulties here. Apologies in advance. Okay. All right. So, disclaimer concluded. Let's go. I'm going to, so today we're talking about loan forgiveness. And this is something that the truth is comes directly from the Bible. It comes directly from the Bible in the form of what is known as Shemitah, or the sabbatical year, and even more radically, the Jubilee year. And this has nothing to do with the source of the loan. The conversation as to where the loan came from. This was the Torah trying to take, in its context of ancient times, a seemingly intractable problem and make it a little better. And we see this, by the way, in a number of laws that happen in the Bible, where there's a reality on the ground, and the Torah doesn't like that reality, or Jewish culture doesn't like that reality. And you'll hear more about this word on Kol Nidre if you're with us. The Judaism seeks to be proudly countercultural. Proudly countercultural is the working title of my Kol Nidre sermon. Judaism seeks to be proudly countercultural from its context of, let's say, 3,000 years ago, to try to correct or at least ease a societal challenge. I'll give you some other examples of this before we jump in. Then I'll pause for some comments, and then we'll jump into the text. So the classic example of this is the reality in Torah times. So we're talking 3,000 years ago. The reality in Torah times of blood vengeance as a form of vigilante justice. You know this. If you've ever watched The Princess Bride, you know what blood vengeance is. My name is Indigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. That is what blood vengeance is, and it was the way that especially nomadic tribes and clans, small clans, mostly based around families and genetic lines, basically executed justice. They didn't have courts. They had elders, and then they had weapons. And so if you were wronged, you could wrong back. The problem with that is once you wronged back, you didn't do it in a thoughtful, measured way and say, oh, you cut off my little finger, so I'm going to cut off your little finger. Please hold still while we execute this justice. It tended to almost always escalate, right? And the Torah saw this. And so the Torah did not outlaw blood vengeance, but imposed limits and laws on blood vengeance. This is the type of this is the type of circumstance in which blood vengeance would be relevant. We're going to set up courts for situations in which it wouldn't be relevant, cases that are perhaps more egregious. These are the measured limits to what that is. By the way, this was probably the original understanding for lex talionis, the eye for an eye and things like this, is that it was intended to limit justice, not be, when we hear eye for an eye, that sounds horrific to us, right? The original idea of it was eye for an eye was intended to limit things so it wouldn't end up being life for an eye, right? That's what originally was most likely going on. There are tons of other examples of this in the Bible where there is an existing practice that feels icky, to use the technical term, that the Torah does not outlaw completely usually, but it curtails. The most sort of historically troublesome and perhaps apologies triggering for some people would be slavery. Insofar as the Torah does not attempt to outlaw slavery, but the Torah places strict limits on what that slavery can look like and how those slaves, and in some cases indentured servants who choose to use their laboring strength as a commodity, how those people are protected in some way. That is a way of the Torah looking at something. There are this happens in the cultic life, the ritual life of Judaism as well. The Torah didn't like, for example, cultic sex. Right? We know about this. How would you honor the Greek god of Bacchus? Right? There would be cultic prostitutes, and that's how you would honor up that god. The Torah didn't like that. It caused a whole lot of problems, as you might imagine, and so the Torah actually outlawed. So you get the idea that the Torah has this idea of looking at a reality, saying, I don't like the reality in the whole pagan world around me, and we are going to define the Jews in a special way as the special people who limit that or make it a little more tolerable. The ketubah, the wedding document, was in its original term. Now we talk about how it's misogynistic and how it's acquiring a woman and how terrible that's. In its original context, the ketubah was a very progressive document. The idea that women would have rights as acquired chattel, it was revolutionary 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. And so that's what we're talking about here. And when we get into loan forgiveness, you're going to see that is what this system has been set up with. I want to stop, see if there's any questions, comments, or thoughts on that or clarifying. And then we're going to, with that in mind, the idea that there is an issue here that seems intractable, that needs to be solved, then perhaps most of us would agree that it's not a good situation. Then the question of how we solve it becomes a question of tactic as opposed to a question of ideal. That's the goal here. Any questions? I can't see all of you on one screen, so don't be shy, unmute yourself, ask a question or make a comment, and then I'll try to be as responsive as I can. So please go, anyone. Was I that clear? I couldn't have been that clear. I'm never that clear. Was I that obscure? Maybe I was that obtuse.
When you say the Torah comes up with the answer, who's writing this? Who are these guys? And no women were involved.
So, okay. So that is a great question. Hold on for 1 second. I'm going to make sure that my children are laughing and not Lord of the Fliesing one another. Give me 1 second here. Okay. No Lord of the Flies yet. I'm happy to say that would be something that Torah would want to contain. So it's a good question, Hillary, and it's probably worth a study hour or lifetime in and of itself. That one didn't sound good. So Anael, okay. My grandmother of blessed memory used to say, all that laughter is going to end up in tears, always, right? And I think we just got there. The short answer of it is that probably in these situations there was an amassing of wisdom, which I think actually anthropologists would mostly call folklore, and that was rituals and stories and laws that came out of stories, like the classic example of that is why we don't eat the sciatic nerve, is because there was a story of Jacob wrestling with the angel and wrenching that part of his sciatica, and anyway, you get the idea. And all of that sort of coalesced and amassed into a defined and definitive tradition. What I mean by that is Jews are the people who don't eat pork. And it wasn't just Jews saying that proudly. It was other people. Like we have Roman text saying, you know that weird people. They don't eat pork and they slack off one day a week because the weekend hadn't been invented yet, right? Romans, if you were in the servant class of Romans, you worked every day of your life, right? You're welcome. We invented the weekend. So, by the way, that's another one we could do, because for hundreds of maybe 200 years, the weekend has been 2 days. But people are talking about, in Europe especially, that it should be 3 days. So you get the idea. But that we have a moment, which we call Mount Sinai, where this all seems to sort of coalesce. And if you are of the more traditional streams of Judaism, by that I mean Orthodoxy, you believe that all of the wisdom happened or culminated at that moment, and everything else from the moment of the top of that mountain was literally downhill, right? If you are a conservative Jew, I can't tell you what you believe, but conservative Judaism professes that we don't know if there were coalescing moments. We actually know some of them historically. For example, I know that because of in a much more historical time, I know that after the destruction of the temple, there was a moment where law coalesced in a very significant way that became known as the Mishnah, right? I know that in the late 17th century, after the false messiah Shabtai Tzvi was proven to be, in fact, a false messiah, that a whole new stream of Judaism that eventually became Hasidism gave a new approach to Judaism. Those are more historical coalescing moments. But we have one back in the annals of formation, which we call Mount Sinai. I, as a conservative Jew, believe that something happened back then to cause us to coalesce on this identity and on this set of values and laws and stories, and making them sacred, elevating them from campfire stories to a way of life. I believe that something happened. By the way, I'll be talking a little bit about this in my high holiday warm-up thing next Thursday, the 15th. Something happened, right? And ever since then, there's been a conversation which involved not only the people who were given that voice, namely the men, but also the women, and others, that it was almost like a snowball effect, right? We had a little core that happened at one point in time, and then all of a sudden we started to live with it, and it got bigger and it got bigger and it got bigger, and maybe more complicated, or maybe certain things fell off the definitional piece, right? Like the joke about keeping kosher, and God says you shouldn't boil a kid in its mother's milk, and Moses says, got it, God. So we'll wait 3 hours, but some people wait 6 hours. But if you're Dutch, you can only wait 1 hour. And God said, no. All I'm saying is don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, right? And I got it, God. We'll have 2 different sets of plates, but really 4 because of Pesach, right? And God says, don't boil his kid in its mother's milk. That's all I'm saying. Moses boils kid. And says, great. So we'll have all of these different signs and symbols, like a Kuf K and a star K, but people won't hold by the tablet K because we don't like the tablet K, and some like Hebrew National and some don't. And God says, Moses, all I'm saying is don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses, got it, God. Okay, so here's my next idea. And God says, Moses, do whatever the heck you want, right? Okay, right? Because it starts to snowball, right? It starts to grow. The tradition doesn't stay static, according to conservative Judaism. Once it's lived, it grows. We know that. We started with a constitution, and now we have all these statutes and laws, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of laws in different municipalities and things like that in America. And we interpret them based on the core, but it is, now, what was once a document that could be, put on one piece of paper as a constitution is now volumes upon volumes of precedent and legal sources and laws to support and buttress the Constitution and things like that. So that's kind of the way this process works. But each time, and now I'm going to circle back to loan forgiveness, each time a societal reality presents, you have to respond to that societal reality. So, Moses never used a microwave, but a microwave is not fire. I know some people, Joel's like, you're kidding. Moses never used a microwave. I mean, how did he make popcorn, right? So Moses didn't have corn. So now we have to decide whether a microwave is actually cooking in the same way that a fire is cooking. Is it heat? What is the technology of it? Can it be done on Shabbat? Can it not be done on Shabbat? The answer is probably not. But is it cooking? Also probably not exactly in the same way. And so these are the types of societal realities that make us answer to the tradition using the tradition. And that's really what we see with loan forgiveness. One more example of this that we have learned here in past years that's really tricky, but I think and emotional is we are not sure when people die because of technology, right? If you believe that that someone dies when their heart stops, then we have invented immortality, because we have a machine that can keep a heart beating, not indefinitely, but for a really long time after anyone would logically consider it life. And that forces us to look at the societal reality and say, it's not good for society to keep people alive artificially that way, and force families to keep their loved ones alive artificially that way in the name of sustaining life. So we have to redefine what death is. That's a hard one, but that's the way this works. That's the way this works. And loan forgiveness is one of the earliest realities of this, because what happened in the ancient world, and frankly still happens today, how's that for social commentary, is this thing called a wealth gap, right? People who are poor, absent something to help them or some miracle, tend, not always, but tend to get poorer. And the classic example of this is the person who every year has to buy a pair of low quality boots with cardboard soles because they can't afford in one fell swoop to buy the ones that will last them 10 years. And if you can afford to buy the ones that last in 10 years, you actually, over those 10 years, will spend less than the person who has bought 10 pairs of boots and each time made themselves sick and got their feet wet and wore them out, before the end of the rainy season. Poverty tends to beget poverty. Now, the invention of a middle class made that possible, but in ancient times, there wasn't really a middle class. In ancient times, you either were the people who were lucky or the people who weren't lucky. You either had or you didn't have, by and large. And a lot of that had to do with land, and a lot of that had to do with family and holdings and things like that. So what happens if you're stuck? How do you deal with that? Well, I mentioned one before. One of the ways you deal with it is you sell yourself or a loved one into indentured servitude. And after 7 years, you are freed, right? That's part of the Shemitah. The other way is you borrow money or stuff. You borrow mostly money, like whatever the currency of wealth is. But the problem with borrowing money is sometimes you have to borrow money to pay back the money. And this is nothing so ancient. This is something that's happening as we sit here right now, right? People getting themselves in debt. So now I'm gonna, I'll pause for 1 minute I gave you a ton there. And then we'll look at just a couple of texts that will, I think, sort of ground this. Any questions, thoughts before I share my screen? Okay, here we go. Now I got to figure out where this is. Here it is. And good. Everyone can see. Good. We're going to talk about loan forgiveness. Okay. And depending on your feeling about loan forgiveness, you might see specifically college loan forgiveness as just this intractable debt that will never go away. You may see it as an unfair get out of jail free card. You may see it just as part of what it means to invest in your future. Those are across the spectrum how you may feel it. And it may be sort of a little bit of each. But we all know that higher education has become more and more understood to be in the service industries and technology industries and things like that, more and more necessary to be upwardly mobile. The difference between what people can earn and when they can be financially stable and secure without post-high school education is, there's just a huge and widening gap. And college tuition has so far outpaced, long-term inflation rates that it is, if it weren't horrific, it would be comical. Right. And part of that is because what colleges are expected to do. And there's all sorts of good reasons for it, but and some bad reasons for it. So this is what we're talking about. But the investment in an education far outpaces in many cases what the return on that is going to be. But the ramifications for not having an education, a higher education, also has long-term. It's like buying the paper boots, right? You never quite get to the point where you're upwardly mobile. So here's the it happens, I think, 3 times in the Torah, but here's one actually from last week's Torah portion. So I gave you the most timely one, and it's I'll point to some words for you. This is the key word right here in the Hebrew, shmita, which means essentially the remission of debts, right? And here's how it happens. Basically every 7 years, you should, debts that have been held over that time, and debts are mostly because someone who has money lends money to someone who doesn't have money in order to live. So of course they borrow money so they can feed their family. Or they turn over a part of their land that was their land holding and things like that. Then there's this value statement, which it reads like a commandment, but of course it can't be a commandment to say, thou shalt have no needy among you, there shall be no needy among you, but it's really a value statement. And then there's an explanation as to why. God will bless you. If you do this whole Shemitah thing and you remit the debts, then God will bless you, essentially. And then it does this thing that acknowledges human nature. And that is that people who have money like to keep money. Right? I'm not saying that's anything bad about that. There's nothing bad about money inherently. And if you have it, you typically are glad that you have it. And so where I'm pointing here, beware lest you harbor the base thought, the 7th year, the year of remission, is fast approaching. I'm doing this fast because our introduction was a little too long. So the idea here is, let's say someone is sneaky and found a person who was very wealthy who wasn't so sneaky, in fact, wasn't so savvy, in fact, really was not smart about money. That person would say, oh, Shemitah year is coming, and Shemitah year starts with the high holidays, right? So let's say in August of last year, this past year was a Shemitah year. We're finishing a Shemitah year. So let's say every 7 years. So let's say in August of 2021, someone says, oh, I'm going to borrow $100,000 because in October of 2021 is gone. That debt is gone. That's not the way this works, right? And also, if someone is desperate, and you're a savvy businessman, you certainly don't want to say, you don't want people to not have if they genuinely need. Okay, little girl. If to not have if they genuinely need, because she's saying hi to everyone. Because and starve to death because no one will lend you money in the 7th year of the cycle, right? Or in the last year of the cycle, essentially. So that's what it is, and so the Torah promises that if you give, especially to people who are desperate, especially as the Shemitah year is coming, even though the debts may be erased, you will be blessed by God, and you'll get plenty more times over what you would have gotten just by holding on to that money yourself. So because they don't want people to starve to death. Basically, if you're living hand to mouth, the way that this works is you have to borrow money to feed your family. But if you can't borrow money in the 6th or 7th year of the Shemitah because it's going to be nullified, and the wealthy class doesn't want you to nullify the debts because they like having their money and they know that it won't be able to ever be paid back, then you're going to starve to death in the 6th or 7th year. And every 6 years is going to be this massive, massive starvation amongst people who are less well off. We don't like that. That's bad. That's a societal bad. And so the Torah tries to appeal to people's better nature on that and say, if you're wealthy, don't do that. In the 6th year, give out the money because God will bless you and you'll get it back. I promise you'll get it back. I promise you'll get it back. And it says, open your hand to the poor and the needy kin in your land. So that's the basic mitzvah and the basic anticipation of how human nature is going to cause that mitzvah to be undercut. Because the intention is good. The intention is that there won't be this widening wealth gap such that people sort of enter this cycle of indebtedness, because every 7 years there's a way back. However, it also recognizes that people in this well-intentioned way of sort of remitting debts, people could also those same people that you're trying to help could actually starve to death because the wealthy people won't lend them money at the end of the cycle. And so it tries to appeal to better nature in that and philanthropic nature in that, because the debts are remitted. It's just they're saying your crop is going to be a bounty crop if you still lend to people, essentially, if you're a landed class. Now, this is the base idea of loan forgiveness, right? It gets more complicated, I promise, on the very next slide, but I'll pause for a second and see if I've been clear or if anyone has any questions on this. Lee, go ahead. Lee, I don't hear you. Is your microphone being recognized? You might have to name a microphone. While Lee is working on it, if you use the up caret against the mute that's next to the mute, you might have to name a microphone. Or you can put something in the chat. That's the other way to handle it.
Rabbi, I'll ask a question while we're waiting for Lee. Did other civilizations, other cultures copy this ancient concept of loan forgiveness?
It's a good question. So, this is going to be sort of a humble brag. Like, I don't know, in the sense that like so many of the, at least Western civilizations that existed come from our stuff, right? So like us, of the 7+ billion people on this earth, over half of them have this as a sacred text, right? And or arguably more, even a higher percentage earlier. So yes, there are other cultures that have remission of debt, and the question is, did they copy it? Was there an idea of it that was more codified here? Okay, Lee, I'll get to interest as well. It's a good question. I didn't put that in here, but that is a complicating factor on this. Yes. There were ideas of this, but it's very clearly codified in the Torah. And the truth is, like, I don't know what the Hittites and the Jebusites, because I haven't ever had an opportunity to ask a Jebusite or a Hittite. Like, there's not around, right? But there are other cultures that have ideas of how to deal with this. And the reason is that it was a problem, right? It was a big problem. And so all cultures are going to try to answer that unless they really honestly don't care. And they can say, the heck with those people, right? And that's not a culture that we would seek to emulate anyway. I'll answer Lee's question. It's a good question. According to the Torah, it says you should not charge undue interest. What that means, undue, is highly legislated in the Mishnah and later on. It does specify that he shouldn't charge another Jew interest. That is true. That is where money lending to non-Jews in the Middle Ages came about, because Jews were not allowed to own land, but Jews could amass wealth that was not landed. And so if Jews managed to amass a little bit of wealth, they could certainly charge tons of interest to non-Jews. In some ways, the idea of interest is also a financial reality. In this particular case, it seems that we are talking about a situation where interest is not, or is at least not major, a factor, because this is we're talking in this particular case of the Shemitah between two Jews, right? And so in this particular case, that is the case. However, interest is another situation where the society recognized a problem, where someone would have money, someone would be desperate, and they'd charge, like a loan shark, basically, like, 25% interest compounded daily or something like that. And, and I have to feed my family, so I'll sign any paper, right? And maybe I'll run away from the obligation. All of this feeds into the cycle of debt. So it's a good question.
Rabbi, do we know whether people actually did this? I mean, is this something that actually happened, or is this aspirational?
It's a good question. So it certainly is aspirational, but it did happen, right? I mean, in its ideal form, it is definitely aspirational. And we know that because of the next text that I'm going to bring you in 1 second, where the whole system fell apart. Okay, so they set it up and it fell apart almost immediately, right? And by almost immediately, I mean certainly within the first 800 years, which in Judaism is almost immediately. And I'll get you to Barbara in a second. It certainly is aspirational, but it certainly seems to work to be there. It is still in ways observed in terms of land and ownership of land in the land of Israel, within the boundaries of the land of Israel, still today. During a Shemitah year, it is very difficult to profit on your farms and things like that because of what landed ownership means and how loans are done. And I'm going to give you the other example in a second, but Barbara, you had a question. Go ahead. Unmute. There you go. I can't hear you, Barbara. I don't know if other people can.
Nope.
Connected. Is
There we
that
are.
better?
That's much better. There you go.
Thanks. Well, as a proofreader and grammarian, I had to note the way the paragraph is set up. Hello, Anael. The way it starts with, there will be no needy ones among you. And then the next sentence is, but if there's a needy one among you, and you do this, that, and then it ends with, but there will always be needy ones among you.
Right. And so I think that that's a big piece of it, and a partial answer, Stan, to your question of how aspirational is this. They set up a system that's a value-based system, and as so often is the case with value-based systems, unless you really set up strong structures, they're not going to work, right? And that'll, I think, bring us to our next text. Barbara and Stan have done a good job of that. So here we go. I'm going to bring this back. Here's the text. Okay. So it didn't work, especially the part of asking the wealthy class to trust that God was going to give you back and then some if you distributed loans at a time when you knew that those loans were unlikely to ever be repaid right before the Shemitah year, right? And so it didn't work, and poor people were starving because of it, because people said, yeah, I trust God, but I really trust cash. And so poor people could not get loans to feed short-term loans to feed their families and to get cash in the end of the Shemitah cycle. And so Hillel, you know, named after the sandwich on Passover, Hillel he comes up with something that, by his own admission, completely undermines what the Torah says, number one, and number two, he made up. He completely made it up. And it's called a prose bool. A prose bool is probably I think it has a Greek origin as a term, mostly because we know it's not a Hebrew word. It's not an Aramaic word. We don't know what it is. It's probably a Greek or maybe Latin root. And essentially what the prose bool does is as follows. It says it right in there. It says, I am going to loan Yosef some money, knowing that the Shemitah year is coming up. And here's what we are going to agree. This document, this document, the promissory note or whatever it is, I'm going to hand over to a trusted institution. Okay, ask Avi. He will do it for you. Thank you. Avi is go look for him. He's in the house. I promise you, he's in the house. So I'm going to hand the asset of this promissory note over to a trusted communal authority, a judge or something like that. And because it is not a one-to-one obligation of lender and borrower, that will survive the Shemitah year, because what the Torah says is really, it describes a relationship between a borrower and a lender, and an institution like a bank or a judge or a something like that is not subject to the Shemitah. And so my IOU will survive the turnover of the Shemitah year. And therefore, if it's towards the end of the Shemitah cycle, and I don't have to worry about lending to this family in need, because all we have to do is make this one extra stipulation of the prose bool, and in the next Shemitah cycle, it will have survived the turnover. In the nonprofit world, this is like the beginning of a new fiscal year, and all of a sudden that profit or that loss all of a sudden magically poof disappears, right? Okay, because that's the way the accounting works. And this basically says, no, this is going to be a restricted fund that survives the end of that fiscal year, right? Maybe I'm, sharing what we do here at Edith Israel a little too much, but you get the idea. So this is the way it has to happen. And the rabbis have a real problem with this, because Hillel admits that he made this whole idea, because I got a great idea. People are starving because no one's going to lend money to them. So here we go. I'm going to make a way that it's good for them to lend money, that the people in the moneyed class don't have to worry about losing their money. As well, they shouldn't have to worry about it. And the rabbis turn around and say, Hillel, that took a lot of chutzpah to come up with something that the Torah doesn't say. The Torah says that debt is gone. The Torah has a reason to say that debt is gone, so that there's not this cycle of constant growing wealth gap. The Torah makes a promise that if you do this, even at a time when you will be economically vulnerable, if you have money, that God will bless you. And Hillel says, meh, I'm going to do it a different way. I'm going to make this document that takes care of it. That's the prose bool. And it's because human nature got in the way, and they didn't trust God, right? In this aspirational, idealized way. What would be the modern equivalent of this is, what would it feel like, or what would happen if banks would stop giving college loans if they were going to be forced to participate in loan forgiveness? The government doing it right now, and no one really knows. The government's money just feels like this amorphous thing, and so people either are happy with this or they're not happy with it. But what if, much like the Affordable Care Act, the private sector was asked to participate in this? What if colleges were less likely to give out grants of financial aid to people demonstrating need, because they knew that these people were going to get $10,000 off anyway. Or what if colleges raise tuition by $10,000 over the course of a degree, so that these are the types of things. And because there is that human nature, there will likely need to be some sort of way to make this happen, in a different way. Okay, I'm gonna pick up the pace a little bit, just because I'm mindful of the time, because I want to get to a couple of other texts, and there are only a couple more, so that you have these in your sort of toolbox, and then we can talk. You'll have them. So here's the Tevye on the one hand, on the other hand, right? On the one hand, there he is. On the one hand, we have obligations, and there's a whole section in this coming week's Torah portion, and also in the end of the book of Numbers, which we read over the summer, that says, like, once you make an obligation, you make a vow, like, that's it. It's a vow. It's really hard to undo that vow, right? You shouldn't do that. And you should fulfill it, anything that you have done. And if this is and you'll see this as the counter argument towards loan forgiveness. That's one thing. That's on the one hand. On the other hand is, if that was an impossible vow or a ridiculous or ludicrous vow, Judaism has a mechanism called hatarat nidarim, or the annulling of vows, and even in certain cases, you can essentially do what modern times would basically make the claim that no one in their right mind could have possibly done that. Therefore, definitionally, the person's not in their right mind. Therefore, definitionally, they could not have made that vow because they're not in their right mind, and that sort of thing. This happens a lot of times, by the way, when people don't accept gets. Like, if a woman doesn't accept a get that a man offers her after they've been civilly divorced for a long time, they say that's impossible. It only benefits the woman. How is that possible? She must have meant to fulfill the obligation. These are the types of things that you can undo vows on. The other way that you can undo vows is less legal and more of a value statement. And that is that people make vows and take obligations, financial ones too, all the time. But it may just be that the whole system is rigged against them and it's not fair. And if that's the case, we legislate empathy. And this is the other hand, right? The idea that the idea that if someone is sort of pushed or forced or coerced in some way into taking on an obligation, but that obligation is inherently impossible to fulfill or unfair in some other systemic way, then maybe we have to think a little more about that. So examples of this in Jewish history: people in the Spanish Inquisition, Jews in the Spanish Inquisition who took a vow to follow Catholicism, were welcomed back highly regularly into the community of Jews, because even though that would be a vow that would cause certain legal problems, the vow of apostasy, it was a sort of gun to your head, or in this case, other medieval torture to your head, kind of, burned at the stake kind of situation where the vow was inherently unfair, and so we had to have compassion. By the way, the first thing that we say on Kol Nidre, the idea that we, one of the theories of this whole idea that we permit people who are abaryanim to re-enter the midst of this holy sacred gathering. Abaryanim, one of the translations of that is Iberians, meaning people who were victims of the Spanish Inquisition can come back in even without a vow, or by annulling that vow in the classic annulment of vows that we are going to say in just a couple of weeks, this one, the Kol Nidre prayer, right? Which annuls vows. It says we had all these obligations. We list all the different types of legal obligations that there would be, the way in which you would swear, the financial ramifications of not fulfilling your word, whatever. And what do we say once every year? Poof. Not every 7 years. This is a once a year poof, right? So I want to say a couple of things before I turn it over. One is this last quote by Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., which I think is really important, which is to say that sometimes self-reliance and the obligations we take on to pull ourselves up and to be upwardly mobile, sometimes those things are inherently not fair. right? And that's essentially what this bootstraps quote is, that it's cruel jest to say that a bootless man ought to lift himself up by his own bootstraps, right? But the Kol Nidre prayer, and this is, I think, the last slide I've got for you. Kol Nidre prayer got us in trouble a lot, because in order to be a moneylender, in order to have a business, and also in order to be considered a true Prussian despite your Jewish religion, or a true Frenchman despite your Jewish religion, those countries needed to know that they could trust Jews. And all you had to do if you were trying to make the Jews look bad was say, hey, I got this page in the Machzor that says every year the Jews renege on all their promises. This is, I gave you one example of this, but there are dozens of them in the literature of emancipation in the Prussians and former Holy Roman Empire and German thinkers, as well as French. Nicolas Donin he had converted out of Judaism and was set up in a disputation against Rabbi Yechiel ben Yosef, and held this one up in front of the Catholic tribunal to say, see, Jews are not trustworthy, and Yechiel ben Yosef, Rabbi Yechiel ben Yosef, had to respond to it, right? And this is just one example of this. There's one Herr Mike, I don't even know how to say his name. It's German, Michaelis or something like that, who levied a similar accusation. So this idea of if you don't uphold your commitments, you are not trustworthy is a big problem. Now, it's not really what Kol Nidre is intended for, and Rabbi Yechiel ben Yosef says that, you can see, but you get the idea. And so here we have this really complicated issue, and no matter where you fall on the political piece of whether the government should be involved in this, whether people should, there should be a return to the sort of non-higher education handicraft and trade industry, whether there's 1,000 complicated pieces of this. But the fact is that what both ancient Judaism and modern society is trying to do is to say, we have valued and placed and almost to get into a certain level of financial security and almost inestimable value on higher education, such that it is almost impossible to do what we're asking people to do without higher education. And that higher education places people in debt in ways that is absurdly out of pace with anything that most people could ever pay off. I made a joke in the blurb that Len sent out today that I'm still paying off, well, mine are grad school dues, loans. But this is what it is, and I'm 46 years old, and I'm living alongside the debt, but the debt still exists, and I'm not complaining about it, but you get the idea, right? That this, it is one indication of a much more intractable problem, that people, especially people that for reasons of life circumstance or whatever, don't get the benefit of salary of having finished the degree, even more so, and that's part of the issue here. And so it's a really difficult problem that is then sort of corrupted by the politics of it, of making it only about your obligation, or only about reneging on your obligation, or only about I paid my dues, why don't you pay your dues? And I think that those are all incredible oversimplifications of what is a societal reality, an attempt to solve that societal reality, which we may or may not agree with the tactic, the strategy, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the reality is here, that you have 50-year-olds who are paying off loans, from decades before, and what that does to their upward mobility and their sense of economic security and their ability to invest in the future of a society. That is the intractable problem. This is a solution. It may not be the best solution, and the devil is certainly in the details, right? But the value of trying to answer this difficult solution, I think, is worthwhile. I'll end with just one example of this, and then I'll stay on because I know I overshot my time. If anyone else wants to ask questions. So one of the things, it's going to be such minutia, but one of the things I'm most proud of in terms of the way the conservative movement over the last 2,000 years has done in Jewish law is an example of this that's totally different than loan forgiveness. This is the issue of what's called aguna. And aguna is a woman who is chained to a non-existent marriage. In ancient times, people would, a couple would get married, and the man stereotypically would go off to the merchant marine and, try to seek their fortune, and he would be lost at sea. No one knows if he's alive, if he's dead. The woman can't remarry because no one knows if he's alive or he's dead, because he hasn't given her a get, and there's no witnessing that he's dead. Get meaning a Jewish divorce. Nowadays, we don't have so many people in that situation, though it did happen, by the way, in the towers at 9/11, timely for this week, where you had observant Jews on the 121st floor or whatever it was saying, leaving voicemail messages saying, this is Yosef, I'm in the Mackenzie offices. I'm not going to make it out. Tell my wife that I'm no longer living. And if you don't believe me, I hereby authorize you to write a get on her behalf. Which is a horrific thing to say as your last words of to your family, and saying that to multiple witnesses, making like 2 or 3 phone calls like that to make sure that everyone gets the messages. And but nowadays it more happens that people will get civilly divorced and the man refuses to give a Jewish divorce, and the woman, it becomes a negotiating tactic that gets really ugly and is highly unethical. The conservative movement saw this. It's a 2,000-year-old problem, and the rabbis in the Talmud basically throw up their hands. They have no solution for it. And the conservative movement said, that's not okay. We're going to write a document that you have to sign alongside the ketubah that basically says, if ever, God forbid, we get civilly divorced, we promise one another we're going to show up at a Beit Din, at a Jewish court, to get a get. And we're going to commit ourselves that way. And I ask all of my couples to sign this piece of paper, regardless of whether I ask them all to do it. So it's not a statement on the quality of their marriage. This is we're closing a loophole in Jewish law. This has been going on since the 1970s in different capacities and different documents. Late 1970s, I believe. Something called the Lieberman Clause was the first one, if you've ever heard of that. And by the way, Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy, now has a document as well. But conservative Judaism said, this is an intractable problem that we must solve. And they did. We did. And it's a weird thing to be proud of, but I think that's the way that law should work. We see a problem and we propose a solution. Is it a perfect solution? No. Is it a reasonable solution? Is it an attempt? Is it a first go? Are there going to be better solutions out there for loan forgiveness or for the Aguna situation? Or, yeah, maybe. But it continues that conversation in a way that makes law dynamic and responsive and compassionate. And if we take as axiomatic that law should be compassionate, that we should love one another, this one, right? That gives us a framework on which laws we need to focus on to fix. And just because it's in the Torah does not mean that it does not need to be fixed. By the way, that is perhaps the most radical thing I've said to you so far. Just because it's in the Torah does not mean it doesn't have to be fixed. It does. Because law is dynamic and society evolves and we evolve with it and we come up with new challenges and new tsuris and new issues, and we need the chutzpah to fix the tsuris. So that's what I got for you. I'm happy to stay on for comments, questions, or otherwise. Yeah. And Len put in a nice blurb about Tom Byron and the temple archives. Yes. The Jewish archives.
Question.
Yeah.
Going back in time, the rich had to help the poor. Was it across the board or only certain people? How did you figure out who was rich and who wasn't and who got the money?
Well, at least the way we understand it in look, there weren't like, corporations and
Right.
it was very localized. What it meant to be wealthy is that you had this land, right? There weren't multinational corporations, right? So in this case, what it seems to be are people who can't provide for their basic needs are poor. And those basic needs are food, shelter, education, bride prices, ransoms if your wife gets abducted by pirates. You know, it sounds funny, but these are the things that were baseline needs. And if you didn't have those things, then you know, there were
Did
mechanisms.
the same wealthy people have to keep giving every year to these people?
It still works that way.
Well, to some degree, but back then there weren't as many.
No, but I mean, this is going to sound so tongue-in-cheek, and I don't mean this to minimize anyone's generosity, and I hope that you are all generous to your means and not beyond those means, but that you push yourself in your generosity, as we all should, right? That's the disclaimer there. But what is the thing that we say when you register for the high holidays and you get to the little part that says your high holiday annual appeal? We say there's a checkoff that says, you know, obviously you can say no, thank you. There's a checkoff that says, I'll give what I gave last year, or I'd like to give this amount, right? And the vast majority of people, depending on if their circumstances have not changed, the vast majority of people, when they register, I believe, click off, I'll continue to give each year. And I say that with incredible, inestimable appreciation, because I would not be here, and Adath Israel would not be here without that, right? But yes, if you have, it is a Jewish value to say, if you have, you shouldn't impoverish yourself, and you should not be ashamed of having luxuries, but if you have those things, you should give. So the classic example of this is the wealthy person who ended up being Rabbi Akiva's father-in-law, a guy by the name of Kalba Savua. And he was incredibly generous and incredibly wealthy. And I think that the fact that people can do that, every time I speak to someone about a potential gift on behalf of Adath Israel, and I do it, because I believe in the cause of Jewish continuity, which is what I think that synagogues are. They're instruments of Jewish continuity. And when people are generous, and sometimes generous even beyond what I could have imagined, I am humbled and in awe that people are thinking outside of their orbit. And I would hope that they're not so generous that, you know, they're not going to eat that night, which I've never had that as an issue. I've never had an issue where someone gives a massive gift to Adath Israel and then comes back and says, you know, I need help. Right now, over years that has happened, right? Meaning like people's fortunes change, but not like the next day. Right. And that yes, that is the way it works.
Rabbi, I remember growing up, my father and his father in Philadelphia talked about associations that were groups of people who put money, I guess, in a pot and helped people, immigrants and other people who came to the United States and other people who needed help.
Yep.
Very informal way.
Yeah, so there are still what are called in the Orthodox world gemachs, which is like this weird abbreviation called a gemilut chasadim, an act of loving kindness society. And there can be gemachs on like 1,000 things, like on if you can't afford baby diapers, we're going to make sure we're going to deliver anonymously a thing of baby diapers to you. There's also if you go to especially some of the older cemeteries in Philadelphia, and you'll see like a sort of smaller pathway, not the ones you can drive on, with sometimes an arch or maybe 2 pillars standing up that'll say the Chesed organization of and it like goes back to some town or some Yiddish phrase that I don't fully understand. That's what these were. They made sure that people got buried. And you joined them sometimes, you know, with very little money, but they did the body purification, they did the burials, that's how this stuff happened. And that was also another Hillary, another basic need was proper burial for a loved one. Thank you, Jerry.
Well, instead of money, did they ever just give food? I mean, they always say instead of giving them money, give them food instead of, you know, was that an option back then? Was it always just money?
It wasn't always money. In fact, in some of these tribal circumstances, currency was not necessarily the way in which it was happening. especially the agrarian societies, and that's right. So I see a number of comments, remembering or acknowledging some of these efforts, but it easily could be chicken for Shabbos, which we take for granted. But by the way, in even 150 years ago, the idea that you would eat meat even weekly on Shabbos was like, oh my God, a luxury. There's songs that are written about it. There's a Shabbos song. It says, I'm going to have to sing it because I'm not going to come up with it without singing it. It's Litaneg b'tanugim baraburim musla v'dagim, which means we are going to lavish ourselves with extravagant food like pheasant and fish. Right? Nowadays you say, okay, I picked up a plastic wrap thing of salmon. I'm going to throw it on the grill, right? As back then, the idea, talking about defining characteristics, right? The idea that there was a people that every Friday night in pre-modern times would have a lavish meal every Friday night. It's crazy. It's crazy. And then they wouldn't work it off the next day. We were insane. We were nuts and slackers and extravagant. And we held their money, which made us really unpopular because of the money lending thing. Thank you, little girl. Any other questions or comments? Thank you. There's a unicorn on my face.
One thing that surprised me in our discussion, not to take it too far from the concept of loving kindness, but we never related all this to modern concept of bankruptcy and the availability of bankruptcy.
So that I think is a whole other lesson. Bankruptcy is one of those ones that I think cuts both ways, right? And we know, we can all think of, I'm not going to name individuals, but you can know which individuals you might be thinking of that have used, and it's true of every law. You can always find someone who uses a law to their questionable morals of personal benefit. Bankruptcy is one of those ones that is both an effort to cut the cycle of intractable debt, and it has very similar issues that it would have been a good one to bring up. It's a good point, because it also has this question of, can we really by fiat nullify our obligations one to another, or and it becomes complicated, and the law exists for its best intention, much like all of these laws. It exists for its best intention of economic justice, and it is used in its most high-profile cases simply to protect the wealth of people who have some other business that is, flowing everything in money-wise. Someone who declares bankruptcy is not necessarily destitute, as we well know. Well, thank you all. I hope this is helpful. And it was great learning with you. This is a big issue. So I wish you all well. We're back next month, I believe. Well, I know where I will be on the first Wednesday of next month. It's not here. Right? I will be recovering from Kol Nidre. By that I mean it'll still be Yom Kippur, and so I believe, Len, if I'm not mistaken, that we bumped it to the 12th, the second week, and that'll go out on email. I'm sure we'll make that happen. We'll figure that out. Thank you all.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Everyone be well. See you
Take
all
care.
in Shul.
Take care, everyone. Have a good day.